Story number 1, Whispers of the Void's Requiem. The air pulsed with a tension no silence should hold, its currents weaving secrets through the dim room, its hush thrumming with an unseen rhythm. I stood by the window, the floor creaking with a scent I couldn't place, dust, metal, something foreign, something that clung to my breath, something that knew my restlessness. The space stretched, its edges bending as if the walls were alive, its breath a whisper I couldn't ignore. I was no stranger to curiosity, but this was different. This was a truth that stirred in the shadows. The pulse deepened, a vibration threading through the air, a sound that wasn't mine. The faint light above flickered, casting shadows that danced like memories, their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling on the sill, but the shadows faded, the light dimming, the silence heavier. The room wasn't empty, it was full, brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. I ventured deeper, the space stretching ahead, its surface bending as if the room was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick with a weight that pressed against my chest, a weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine, it belonged to something else, something that stirred in the stillness, something that knew I was here. The vibration intensified, the floor's pulse a drumbeat under my feet, its silence a predator. I carried my regret, a frail shield against the unknown, but the air disagreed, its presence alive with mystery. I was a seeker, a witness, marked by a secret I couldn't unknow it. The breeze sickened. The room a canvas of lives spent and lost, its corners holding echoes of those who'd lingered here, those who'd never left. I was no stranger to guilt, but this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. At this point, there is little that will make any difference. I can protest that I'm a victim. I was always a victim, the same as everybody. But I can't ask for your forgiveness. I'm recording this to tell you how it happened. That won't matter either. It's the only thing I can do at this point, so it's what I'm doing. I found the guitar in an old pawn shop in Boston. The proprietor was a caricature of a pawnbroker, a bent little old man with a hooked nose and wisps of white hair around his ears. His face creased with a permanent frown from too many years of fighting disgust with the stuff people brought in. I didn't bother speaking to him at first, just walked up and down the narrow aisles between the shelves stacked with endless junk. I thought people brought their valuables to pawn, but this guy had somehow acquired piles of rusty old hand woodworking tools, random glassware and salt shakers, chipped china and flatware. That wasn't silver. I felt curiously drawn to a battered old wardrobe that looked like it had been built of leftover tongue and groove siding. I almost opened it, but I was sure it could only be filled with mink coats, judging from the rest of his stuff. Probably moth-eaten mink coats. I felt his eyes glued onto me, waiting for me to try to lift something with my mohawk and torn jeans. I often got that look, but given the worthlessness of this crap, it was almost insulting. I said, screw it, and headed for the door. "Can I help you with something?" he said, husky and suspicious. I looked him straight in the eye. "I doubt you have a guitar." He almost smiled. The corners of his mouth twitched, but then I think they couldn't remember how smiling worked and gave up on it. "I might have a guitar," he said, "for the right price." This didn't sound promising. He didn't say any more. I wondered if you were expecting me to fork over money sight unseen. "Well, do you or don't you, old man?" "I do, kid," he said, which I had to respect after I'd called him old man. It was only fair he called me kid, but I like how he said it. Deliberate, to be clear. He was giving me back what was mine. "Look in the wardrobe right behind you. Don't open the case. Just bring it over here to the counter." It was the wardrobe he'd almost opened. I did now, and found it contained nothing but a dusty rectangular guitar case. I humored the old man, carried it over to the counter. I put it down so it would open toward him. Since he obviously didn't want me to handle it until I'd bought it, he turned it around, flicked open the clasps, and pulled it open, shrinking down behind the lid. Later, I would note that the maneuver protected him from the sight of the guitar. I doubt he really understood what he had, but he was not totally ignorant at the time, though. I just put it down to showmanship. Inside was the most amazing black guitar I've ever seen. It was so black. It looked like there was no guitar there at all. Just some silver frets and strings stretched across, nothing. A guitar shape ripped into the universe. I reached into the case just to touch it, just to be sure there was a guitar there. The old man closed the case partway, nearly trapped. Wrapping my hands inside, I didn't pull away. No, he said, his lips curling back from his teeth. "Not here. I can't buy it if I can't try it." "Take your hand out of the case," I did. I wanted the guitar. I had to hear it first. But frankly, if I didn't play it at all, I'd still have bought it if I could afford it. It was that cool. He shut the case and fastened the latches. "Take it into the basement. There's an old amplifier down there. You can plug it in and play it. But see here, the volume on that amplifier is set on 2, right? It says on 2. Sure, I said whatever." He laid a bony hand on a red fire extinguisher at the end of the counter. "See this? You know what this is for putting out fires?" You'd think so, wouldn't you? But check the pressure gauge. I looked at the dial on top. It was all the way down on empty. The only thing it's good for is bashing out the brains of people who don't follow the rules. Got it, the volume stays on 2. Somehow, I wasn't too frightened at the thought of this old man trying to assault me with a fire extinguisher, except for the thought of trying to convince the police that the punk had acted in self-defense when he broke the little old shopkeeper in 2. It didn't matter. I didn't need the guitar to be loud to tell if it could play. I took the case and went through the little door down the steep steps. It crossed my mind that I was probably doing something stupid going down into this crazy old man's cellar looking for, a cask of Amonito. But frankly, the door was so flimsy, I could turn it into kindling if he tried to lock it behind me. All he did was yell down at me about keeping the volume on 2. The room's pulse was a spark, its whispers a truth that lingered in my curiosity, a truth that followed me to the basement. The air shivered with a chill no peace should defy. Its currents, weaving secrets through the dim basement, its hush pulsing with an unseen rhythm. I stood by the amplifier, the floor creaking with a scent I couldn't place. Metal, ash, something alien, something that clung to my breath, something that knew my awe. The space stretched, its edges bending as if the walls were alive, its breath a whisper I couldn't ignore. I was no stranger to music, but this was different. This was a truth that stirred in the shadows. The chill deepened, a vibration threading through the air, a sound that wasn't mine. The faint light above flickered, casting shadows that danced like echoes, their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling on the strings, but the shadows faded, the light dimming, the silence heavier. The room wasn't empty, it was full, brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. I ventured deeper, the space stretching ahead, its surface bending as if the room was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick with a weight that pressed against my chest, a weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine. It belonged to something else, something that stirred in the stillness, something that knew I was here. The vibration intensified, the floor's pulse a drumbeat under my feet, its silence a predator. I carried my ambition, a frail shield against the unknown, but the air disagreed, its presence alive with mystery. I was a seeker, a witness, marked by a secret I couldn't unknow. The breeze sighed, the room a canvas of lives spent and lost, its corners holding echoes of those who'd worked here, those who'd never left. I was no stranger to power, but this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. In the basement was a chest freezer, a big converted coal furnace, some broken furniture, and a vintage amplifier. I put the guitar down on the freezer and opened the case again down in the basement. It looked even blacker than before. If that were possible, I touched the guitar just to assure myself that it was real. My hand stopped, so there was definitely something there, but I couldn't really feel it. It had all the friction of black ice, but no sensation of cold. A sensation of vertigo crept over me as if I were going to fall into the nothingness. Impulsively, I grabbed the strap that at least felt like leather and lifted the guitar so it hung from my shoulder. It had weight like a guitar. The sensation of vertigo left me when I wasn't staring right at it. I fished a patch cord out of the case, plugged it into the amp and switched it on. I turned the volume up to 2.5 just to screw with the old man, then touched the strings, just the tiny sound a guitar makes when the club owner pulls the plug on. Your show. I only had a moment of disappointment before I remembered that this amplifier probably had vacuum tubes. It would need to warm up before it would play. I waited a minute. The amplifier hummed with potentiality. Then I struck the open strings. Or I meant to. I hit them one after the other in a slow arpeggio to hear how far out of tune it was. But on the first note, my fingers froze. It was indescribable, a deep, resonant tone that sounded like it came out of the primeval, past a note imagined by alien races that had looked down on Earth when all life was just slime on the bottom of the sea. It unseated my bowels from the rest of my viscera and set them floating uneasily. I took a deep breath and plucked out the first 7 notes of Stairway to Heaven. It seemed like the right riff to try the guitar, spoke with the voice of God, but not the all-forgiving God of the Gospels, nor even the strict pedant God of evangelicals. This was the Old Testament God, mighty and awful, the God that shook mountains and spoke in thunder and trumpets, the God that smote the Adamites by the thousands. My head swam. I was terrified, and at the same time, I had to have this guitar. I would pay whatever price the old man asked. I snapped off the amplifier and forced myself to walk slowly up the stairs. The door was unlocked. The old man was back where he had been behind his counter, adding rows of figures in a little black book. I tried to act casual. "How much you want for it?" It came out as a shaky, tense whisper. So much for acting casual. The old man would have to be deaf to not know I'd pay whatever he asked. But maybe he was deaf. He didn't even look up. I repeated myself louder and less desperate. He glanced up, surprised to see me standing in front of him. Then he took an earplug out of one ear. If he hadn't heard me, he knew what I'd said. $2,000. My stomach, already dangerously unmowed, flipped over again. That was 4 times what I told myself was my maximum price when I set out guitar hunting. I drew a deep breath and tried. I can't pay more than he interrupted, and thumped a hand-lettered sign on the wall behind him. "Do not try to. Ticker, all prices are firm on another day." I knew that. Just because you put something on a sign doesn't make it true. Saying he didn't dicker was just the first round of dickering, but I didn't have it in me. I had to have the guitar. I took out my wallet and pulled out my credit card, wondering what hope I would have of paying this off. "Can't you read?" he snarled and thumped another hand-lettered sign. "All sales are cash only." "Can I hold it with the deposit?" I asked. "How much you got?" He asked. $50. "There's a cash machine on the corner. You could take out $250. Make it $300. I could. I'd even have enough left to eat until payday. Paying rent would take some imagination, but I could do this. It may take me a little while to work up the rest and come back." Even as I said it, I knew it was hopeless. I'd never have $700 in cash. Not unless I took a cash advance on the credit card and paid the 30% interest rate. "No," he said, "don't come back. If you walk in my door again, I'll bash your brains out with this fire extinguisher. But $300, he said, in cash. Go get it. Now, then take your guitar and get the hell out of here. If I see you again, I'll kill you." The man was clearly raving mad, but $300 was a price I could pay. I went out to the cash machine, traded all my money for the guitar, and left before he could make good on his threat. It was only then that I realized I'd even given him my bus fare home. I wound up walking 2 miles through the city. I got home late and tired. Playing the guitar seemed like too momentous a thing to attempt. In that state, I put it aside, microwaved a can of mushroom soup, and went to bed early. But I didn't sleep well. I dreamt about the guitar in my dreams. It wasn't just black. There were stars twinkling in the void. When I tried to pick it up, my hands went right through it. I felt like I could reach deep in and scoop out a handful of stars, except I figured they'd be terribly hot. I thought they'd make tiny little burns in my hand. There was something behind the stars, too. Something vast and restless. A long, slow rolling in the dark. I didn't want to touch that thing. I didn't want to disturb it. It was asleep, but not deeply. I hardly dared to breathe. If I woke it, I had no idea something very bad would. Music happened. The room's pulse was a weight. its whispers a truth that lingered in my awe, a truth that followed me to the dream. The air thickened with a strain no rest should bear, its currents weaving secrets through the dim studio, its hush pulsing with an unseen rhythm. I stood by the amp, the floor creaking with a scent I couldn't place. Wood, sweat, something that clung to my breath, something that knew my doubt. The space stretched, its edges bending as if the walls were alive, its breath a whisper I couldn't ignore. I was no stranger to performance, but this was different. This was a truth that stirred in the shadows. The strain deepened, a vibration threading through the air, a sound that wasn't mine. The faint light above flickered, casting shadows that danced like warnings, their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling on the cord, but the shadows faded, the light dimming, the silence heavier. The room wasn't empty, it was full, brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. I ventured deeper, the space stretching ahead, its surface bending as if the room was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick with a weight that pressed against my chest, a weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine. It belonged to something else, something that stirred in the stillness, something that knew I was here. The vibration intensified, the floor's pulse a drumbeat under my feet, its silence a predator. I carried my hope, a frail shield against the unknown, but the air disagreed, its presence alive with mystery. I was a seeker, a witness, marked by a secret I couldn't unravel. The breeze sighed, the room a canvas of lives spent and lost, its corners holding echoes of those who'd played here, those who'd never left. I was no stranger to chaos, but this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. I was miserable the next day and the day after that, so I never took the guitar out again until the night I rehearsed with the band we called ourselves Catholic Circus, splitting our meager earnings just 3 ways. Leslie fronted the vocals and defined our sound with a loud, rumbling bass. She was a scary little thing, a knife of moodiness under a big mop of black hair. She disappeared under layers of black canvas, and orange-striped tights on the drums was Ethan, an underfed stick of a man with big frog eyes. Every once in a while, he put off shaving until he had half an inch of see-through whiskers on his chin. No one could ever call it a beard. Then he gave up and cut it off. I don't know what you'd call our style, post-punk or goth, are the most frequent labels we get, but we do occasionally go off into the technically demanding solo like a progressive band. But we assiduously avoided the grand pseudo-philosophical lyrics of progressive, and our themes were too dark when reviewer in a local scene Rag described us as playing dance mayob, which I thought was a great description, but it didn't stick. We got the plug pulled on us only once after a patron complained to the bartender that we were depressing. I come here because I feel bad and want to feel better. These guys make me want to kill myself. I felt a little bad about that. My hope is all that will make those guys feel understood. but there was a badge of honor in getting kicked out of a club. I made a production out of my new guitar, telling Lacey and Ethan that they'd never seen anything like it, and getting them to stand around watching while I opened the case. I watched their faces opening it just as the show owner had, standing behind the lid as I raised it. Lacey frowned. Ethan's jaw dropped open. "What's it made out of?" Lacey whispered. She reached out to touch it, but hesitated. "It's like the void," Ethan said. "It's like staring into infinity, the black sky between the stars." "Does it sound as good as it looks?" Lacey asked. I just smiled. I lifted it by the strap and hung it on my shoulder. For some reason, I kept my gaze averted from the guitar, as if I expected to see the thing from my nightmare still rolling beneath the blackness. I patched it into the amplifier, turned the volume to 7 and struck an E minor chord. It vibrated the windows. It was a full, dark sound, but it wasn't the voice of God. It was just an electric guitar, disappointed. I tried hitting the strings one at a time, as I had in the pawn shop. "Just an electric guitar, good enough," Ethan said. "Damn, that hurts my eyes. It's like it's pulling your eyeballs out of their sockets," Leslie said, and turned away. She busied herself setting up her bass. Ethan continued to stare. Maybe it was the volume. Maybe that was why the proprietor had insisted I keep it on volume 2. Maybe it only sounded that good when it was quiet. I turned the volume down and plucked the strings again, still just a guitar. Only quieter. It sounded a lot better in the shop. Sounds great to me. No, it sounded like it came out of the abyss. I still remembered the sound of those few strings I touched. I hadn't imagined it. They were burned into my memory. Maybe it was something with the acoustics where you were. I heard this podcast about these guys who were trying to reproduce the acoustics of ancient cathedrals. They turned this ordinary chorus into the voices of angels. It couldn't have been. I was just in this guy's basement with a big old furnace and a freezer and concrete walls. Could there have been some freak perfection of the dimension and objects? It didn't seem possible. Could there have been an effects block patched into the amp? Ethan asked. He was still staring at me. He hadn't moved towards his drums. I don't see how. I said it was just an old tube amplifier. Oh, that's it. That vintage sound. I have heard Neil Young still uses a tube amplifier because he likes that vintage sound. The thing costs a fortune nowadays because no one makes the tubes anymore. I thought about this. He knew everything Ethan had said, but I doubted an amplifier could make that much difference. If tubes could make a guitar sound like what I'd heard, no one would have invented solid-state electronics. "Hey, Ethan, put your eyes back in their sockets and get on your drums. No matter how beautiful his guitar is, we still gotta play music." "I don't know," Ethan said. "They might book us just so people can look at that guitar." It took him 3 tries to tear his eyes away and sit down at his drums. The practice didn't go well. I was distracted by my disappointment, and my bandmates were distracted by my guitar. Twice. Ethan lost the tempo, slowing down while he stared at my belly. Then, in the middle of the 3rd song, Lacey screeched and stopped playing. "Sorry," she said, shaking her head. Most of the evening, she had been avoiding looking at me, but then she took a long look at the guitar. "Sorry, I swear I saw something moving in your guitar. It was like it was a window into somewhere and there was something moving." "I think it's alive," Ethan said, staring at me. maybe that's why it's not making the sound you want. Maybe you gotta have the right relationship with it before it'll sing for you. It played for me. Before I said I didn't believe him, not really, but in Leslie's dark studio, it didn't sound so crazy. Yeah, but then you weren't trying to show it off. Then all your focus was on the guitar, wanting to hear the guitar tonight. You're wanting to show off the cool guitar you got. Your focus is on you. It doesn't want to put on a show to make you look cool. This is crazy. We can't practice like this. Why don't you face the wall or something? No offense, but it's just a guitar. Yeah, but you don't look at it either, whatever. Let's just play, I said. But I did turn away from them. It didn't do any good. I was too annoyed and disappointed. Lizzie was too rattled. Ethan lost the beat twice more, just staring at the crescent of the guitar he could see past my hip. We gave it up at 10, when we usually jam until the room's pulse was a weight, its whispers a truth that lingered in my doubt, a truth that followed me to the rehearsal. The air crackled with a dread no courage should face, its currents weaving secrets through the dim alley, its hush pulsing with an unseen rhythm. I waited by the gear, the floor creaking with a scent I couldn't place, concrete, tension, something alien, something that clung to my breath, something that knew my fear. The space stretched, its edges bending as if the walls were alive, its breath a whisper I couldn't ignore. I was no stranger to pressure, but this was different. This was a truth that stirred in the shadows. The dread deepened, a vibration threading through the air, a sound that wasn't mine. The faint light above flickered, casting shadows that danced like omens, their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling on the case. But the shadows faded, the light dimming, the silence heavier. The room wasn't empty. It was full, brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. I ventured deeper, the space stretching ahead, its surface bending as if the room was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick with a weight that pressed against my chest, a weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine. It belonged to something else, something that stirred in the stillness, something that knew that I was here. The vibration intensified. The floor's pulse a drumbeat under my feet, its silence a predator. I carried my resolve, a frail shield against the unknown, but the air disagreed, its presence alive with mystery. I was a seeker, a witness marked by a secret I couldn't unknow. The breeze sighed, the room a canvas of lives spent and lost, its corners holding echoes of those who'd performed here, those who'd never left. I was no stranger to risk, but this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. As we were packing up, Wesley said to me, "Why don't you bring your old guitar to the Venus tomorrow? Don't be crazy. You know what I paid for this." Well, actually, I'd gotten it for a steal, but it was the easy thing to say, a lot easier than that. I still hope to make it sing like angels, just in case this is going to be a good show. The Venus draws a good crowd, so we have something to fall back on if your baby derails us again. "It's just a guitar," I said again. "You shouldn't say that. Ethan said no. Wonder it won't sing for you when you talk about it that way. I said it was just a guitar. But I don't think I believed myself. I mustn't have, because on the bus home, I talked to it. I'm sorry if I was trying to show off with you. I said tomorrow night, I promise I won't pay attention to the crowd. I'll just listen to you. I want to hear you sing again, the way you did when I first played you the guitar. Of course, had nothing to say, neither did my fellow bus passengers late at night on city buses. Nobody talks to the people who talk to inanimate objects. You should have a name, I said, then reconsidered. You probably have a name? I shouldn't make up a name for someone as important as you. If ever you can let me know what your name is, I'll use it at that moment. The man next to me put down his newspaper and stood up to get off the bus. Most of the paper was obscured by an ad for great bargains at Walgreens, but I could see just a few words and half of a headline. Hazer, a cold dread crept up my spine. It was coincidence. Coincidence in imagination. I moved the ad circular to expose the full headline. Cemetery killer suspect has turned himself in. See, it wasn't an answer to my question. What was I imagining? That there just so happened to be the exact headline in the newspaper, name for extra, to show me his name when I asked. Or maybe he had mystically transformed the newspaper. He could just as easily have scratched his name into the seat cushion that would have been sure than given me a word and a half to guess at his name. Or maybe he reached across space and time, made the killer turned himself in, made the publisher compose the headline so this would happen. Here now, when I asked Pastor the King in Yellow, the vast tentacle creature who drives men mad just to be looked upon. Or maybe a man dropped his newspaper and my imagination scared me. If is your name, I said softly. Give me a sign. Make something green land in my lap. I held my breath. I'd been specific about the sign I wanted because I knew how easily occult swindlers could suck people in. I ask for a sign and something happens. Anything, a dog barks, a bus goes over a bump, the old man across from me laughs. Something is always sure to happen. The sign, nothing happened. Nothing landed in my lap, green or otherwise. See, no omnipotent elder being was reaching out of the void to introduce himself to me. I am's razor. The simplest explanation. I was scaring myself. I'd arrived at my stop. I stood up to get off. As I stepped on the first stair, the driver called to me, "Hey, son." I looked back. Matthew 4:7. I said. Matthew 4 verse 7. It will answer your question. What question? I asked. How should I know? Look it up. Have a good night. Now you too, I said and stepped off the bus. If you've lived in Boston as long as I have, you probably have had random strangers quote Bible verses at you. You probably never looked them up. I never had before, but I was feeling weird, and it was a weird exchange, and it usually isn't the bus driver who does it. I took out my phone and looked it up. Jesus said unto him, "It is written again, thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God." My gut got that floaty feeling again. I'd asked for a sign, a specific sign instead. I got rebuked. This was ridiculous. I stroked off for home. The line in the Bible was, "Do not tempt God." It was about how to treat God. The rule did not transfer to any other supernatural being, but this righteous denial did not even last the short walk to my apartment, as Antonio said in Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. The devil can cite scripture for his purpose. I locked my door carefully that night. Then I put headgear in the foyer closet as far from my bedroom as I could. Even so, I had weird dreams. I dreamt that my old girlfriend Amelia had been transformed into a guitar. My right hand, plucking the strings, my left on the fretboard, was squeezing her neck. The strings were her chord arteries, and I pinched them closed against the frets, cutting off the flow of blood to her brain. When I played a bar chord, she could not breathe at all. After a few FSH power chords, the sound from the guitar grew weak and fluttery. After a few more, it stopped making any sound at all. I kept playing her dead body. The room's pulse was a weight. Its whispers, a truth that lingered in my fear, a truth that followed me to the night. The air shattered with a silence no hope should endure, its currents weaving secrets through the dim club, its hush pulsing with an unseen rhythm. I stood on the stage, the floor creaking with a scent I couldn't place. Wood, smoke, something odd, something that clung to my soul, something that knew my fate. The space stretched, its edges bending as if the walls were allowing its breath, a whisper I couldn't ignore. I was no stranger to performance, but this was different. This was a truth that stirred in the shadows. The silence deepened, a vibration threading through the air, a sound that wasn't mine. The faint light above flickered, casting shadows that danced like endings, their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling on the strings. But the shadows faded, the light dimming, the silence heavier. The room wasn't empty, it was full, brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. I glanced back, the space stretching behind, its surface bending as if the room was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick with a weight that pressed against my mind, a weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine, it belonged to something else, something that stirred in the stillness, something that knew I was here. The vibration intensified, the floor's pulse a drumbeat under my breath, its silence a predator. I carried my resignation, a frail shield against the unknown, but the air disagreed, its presence alive with mystery. I was a seeker, a witness, marked by a secret I couldn't unknow. The breeze faded, the room a canvas of lives spent and lost, its corners holding echoes of those who'd performed here, those who'd never left. I was no stranger to ruin, but this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. I woke near 1100, groggy and annoyed. In the light of day, it all looked stupid. My guitar was possessed by the spirit of an ancient evil force, not just any ancient evil force, a fictional entity made up by H.P. Lovecraft to spook Victorian gentlemen while implicitly reassuring them that they were the guardians of civilization against the unknown terrors of the past. What was Lovecraft but an attempt to modernize medieval fears of witches and the devil? Instead, you had cultists and cosmic entities, so much more scientific. I'd had bad dreams. Of course, I'd had bad dreams. They weren't caused by the malign influence of the entity in my guitar. They were caused by my imagining an entity in my guitar. My night terror is banished by the cold light of reason. I turned my powerful intellect to the question of how to recapture the sound. I had first heard there were two possible explanations suggested to me: that it was the acoustics of the basement, or that it was the amplifier. Neither sounded likely, but I knew which one I wanted to be true. If the sound had been a quirk of the acoustics of the basement, I'd never recapture it, not unless I persuaded the pawnbroker to let me give concerts in his basement. But if it was the amplifier, I could in theory get the right amplifier. I looked up what it would cost to get an old tube amplifier and was surprised to see that they weren't insanely expensive. Not that I had another $500 in my bank account, but I could get it if I knew for sure that it would give me that sound. I spent the day calling every guitarist I could think of who might have a tube amplifier and be willing to let me try it by 3 hook. I ran out of ideas except for the obvious one: go back to the pawn shop. That, of course, came with an obvious problem: his threat to kill me, but I doubted that was serious. That man had insisted he would not negotiate the price of the guitar, then dropped it from 2,000 to 300 in a heartbeat. His threat to kill me was probably a negotiating tactic as well. He hoped I would come in afraid. I'd walk in the door with a fistful of cash leading the way. Suddenly, I saw it all. He hadn't dropped the price of the guitar when I came back and asked for the amplifier. The price would be $1,700. He threatened to kill me, so I wouldn't come back until I had that $700 in cash in my hand. Which was I to do? Drop a load of money and hope that it would be the right thing, or raise 3 times as much. But no, at 700, I sent a text to Ethan reminding him of our show that night. He hadn't forgotten a show in a long, long time. But the couple times he had were bad scenes in those days. We played short sets in small pubs where the owners were used to the occasional now and disappointing performance. This venue was a big venue, and the owner had a reputation for vindictiveness. He owned clubs in several cities and had lots of friends, or more likely, had a lot of dirt to blackmail other club owners. Bands who screwed him got screwed. I had heard of one band who produced documentation that 3 out of the 4 of them had tested positive for coke. The manager had told them the only doctor's notes Mr. Hawkins will accept is one signed by a coroner as the hour of the show. Drew closer, my sunny courage began to wane. I didn't really notice at first. I threw both guitars into Leslie's truck, but I told myself it was because she'd asked me to, because it would promote band comedy and all that. But still, I thought of my new guitar as HTR. Still, I made sure it was firmly propped against the side of the truck so it would feel properly cared for and respected. We swung by Ethan's to find he wasn't home. No lights, no sound, no sign. You did remind him of the show tonight, didn't you? Of course, I checked my phone. No reply. I called him. Hey, dude, I'm either on my phone or I can't find it. Leave me a message. Hey, we've got a show tonight at the Venus. Where the hell are you? I hung up. Leslie's eyes, barely visible through all her hair, were big and afraid. What do we do? Go on as a 2-piece? She shook her head. Unless we brought the house down. Hawkins would call it breach of contract. Then we got to get a sub. Who do we know who could sit in with no notice? That's crazy. If we're going to find a sub, we need to start calling 5 hours ago. Maybe he'll call back. My phone rang. Oh, thank God, but it wasn't Ethan. It was an unknown number. I was desperate enough to answer it anyway. "Is this Liam?" The voice on the other end said. Yes, I answered. My guts started to unmow themselves again. I knew this was bad. This is Stephen Brooks. I'm a nurse at Mullan Hospital. I'm calling on behalf of Ethan. He isn't well and won't be able to make the show tonight. What I said, although I'd heard him perfectly well, Mullan Hospital. First in psychiatry since 1818, Ethan is being treated here. His condition is stable, but he insisted it was urgent that you get this message. What's wrong with him? I'm afraid that I can't give any more information about his condition, but he will be very reassured to know that you got his message. Yeah, I said then, finally finding some compassion in my soul, I added, tell him it's fine. We'll get a sub. It'll be okay. I hung up. What is it? Leslie asked, reading my face. He's cracked up. He's in the mental hospital. Leslie's eyes darted back and forth as if she were reading some emergency manual in her head. Okay, she pulled out her keys. You drive. I'm going to call every drummer I can think of until someone says they can come. If I have to, I'll promise half our fee. I drove the van and Lizzie called the first person to apologize, said it was impossible. Then she got voicemail. The third laughed at her. I could hear him over the car noise. The fourth sounded afraid at the prospect of going on stage to play songs he'd never heard before. Lizzie tried reassuring him he didn't have to be great, just hold the beat and jam. Then she tried bribing him with money. He didn't bite after that. She just sat in the van and stared to her phone. Try someone else. I can't think of anyone else. What about that guy who plays with Doomcell? They're on tour in Philadelphia. Or Pongo, what's his name? That's who I was just talking to. Hold on, call Honey. Who's Honey? I asked, but she'd been talking to her phone, an old boyfriend. Ellie blushed. He must have picked up because she suddenly said, hey, you'll never guess who this is. You guessed. How are you? It's been so long. Yeah, well, I'm kind of in an emergency here. I've got a show at the Venus in 2. Yeah, at the Venus, thanks. It would be good news if our drummer hadn't faked out on us in 2 hours. Well, I could go get you. Where are you? Worcester, sure I can do that. Worcester, are you crazy? Have your gear by the road. This is going to be tight. That's insane. It's over an hour each way. We'll never make it. Yeah, I can do it, Leslie said, ignoring me. Yeah, be ready. Be at the side of the road in like 70 minutes. Okay, are you insane? Do you know what Hawkins will do to us if we're a half an hour late? Yeah, Bear, you're saving my ass. See you soon. She hung up. This won't work. This is how it's going to work. I'm going to drive like hell to Worcester. When our time comes, you go out, say you're the opening act, and you play solo. If I don't get stopped by Massachusetts' finest, I'll be there before you're 10 minutes in. With luck, the audience will be so busy staring at your guitar, they won't notice. Without luck, the bouncer will entertain the crowds by beating the beat out of me. There's got to be someone else. What about? I did come up with 2 names before she dropped me off, but one she couldn't reach, and the other was playing a show already. When she drove away, her SUV leaned precariously on the first corner. I was there way early. Of course, I wound up standing in the alley with our guitars and amplifiers for 15 minutes, hoping the manager would show up before some enterprising gangster. He did. I set everything up, ran a sound check, got a beer, and waited in the green room while the crowd started to file in 15 minutes before showtime. The manager checked in. "Where's the rest of them? They'll be along," I said, trying to be casual. "I'm gonna open solo." "What?" he scowled at me. "I booked a band." "You got a band?" I said, "Plus, I'm just an opening act. It'll be like if folks see two bands for the price of one, a 50-minute teaser." That was not the contract. He said, "Not that we had a contract. If one person asks for his cover back during your opening act, I'll have your ass deal." By the time I took the stage, my dread of the guitar was creeping back. Ethan was in a mental hospital the day after. He couldn't take his eyes off my guitar. Now, I was going to go on stage and perform in front of 200 people. If there was anything, was I putting the sanity of 200 people at risk? I had the other guitar. I didn't have to take HTR on stage. But that thought was no reassurance either. I had no idea how I was going to keep a club full of people entertained for half an hour by myself. Of course, I'd lied to the manager they'd want to dance, and I had no rhythm section. Even if the manager didn't follow through on his threat, the last thing we needed was for the crowd to be impatient and pissed off before we started playing. No, the only reason I dared to try this was because I had terror to hide behind. I laid my hand on the case. "Hater," I said, "I need you. We're going to go out in front of a big crowd, and I need you to sing for them. Get us through this. Get us through this, and what does one offer? An enchanted guitar." I said the first thing that came into my mind. "A tube amplifier. I'll get you a vintage tube amplifier. Just like the one in the pawn shop. Seriously." I was bargaining with my guitar. I downed my beer, snapped open my case, and took it out. Yes, I avoided looking at it as much as I could, just as I was leaving. The green room, I saw a yellow scarf hanging on the back of the chair. A sheer mustard yellow scarf left behind by some girl band or something, without even a conscious thought. I swept it up and wrapped it around my head, so only my eyes were showing. I walked out onto the stage without any idea what I was going to play. I took comfort knowing that whatever happened, it wouldn't be associated with my face. The club was barely half full, but still, that meant 200 eyes drained on me. By special arrangement opening for Koenig Circus, the King in Yellow. There, tear all glory was to be yours. Having no idea what else to do, I started playing the opening notes of Stairway to Heaven. A lame choice. Every bar band in the amateur cover league played Stairway to Heaven, hoping to copse some of its glory. But it was the official song you always play to try out a new guitar. It did sound better. There was a difference. I got the feeling that H-Tier was trying as hard as it could, but it wasn't half the glory of the pawn shop. It needed the tubes. Vacuum tubes, glass globes containing a tiny piece of the void where H-Tier himself, not the guitar, was imprisoned restlessly sleeping. It needed to touch the void to give full voice. Whatever it was, enough the crowd stood transfixed, unable to take their eyes off of me. I didn't sing. I can sing. I often feel in harmony and counterpoint vocals with Leslie. But I didn't want HTR to have to share the stage when I thought the instrumental Stairway couldn't go on any further. I morphed into the opening riff of Heart's Barracuda and played that for a while. I didn't see any movement in the audience. Even the waitrons, who were supposed to be selling drinks and milking the crowd for cash, were not winding through them when I got all I could out of Heart. I threw caution to the wind. The King in Yellow was not a cover band. I didn't want to play anything from the Catholic set either, so I just started improvising a surge of power chords spiked with bright overtones. I drove as fast as I could, trying to create a wall of sound with only 6 strings. Next thing I knew, I was finger-picking a bass line on the 2 lower strings while simultaneous lie leading on 4 high ones. It was insane. It wasn't me playing. My fingers moved faster than I could track, spinning a web of dark and terrible music. It was hotter playing through me. I lost track of all time. I have no idea how long it was before I spied a chubby man at the foot of the stage waving for my attention. A small feminine hand clapped over his eyes. I looked again. I could barely see Lay standing on tiptoe behind him to peer over his shoulder. The band had come. With some effort, I took control of my hands and ended the song. Back in the green room, I put Hashir in his case and unwrapped the scarf from my head. Lizzie stuck her head in the door. "Is it safe?" "Yeah," I said, not even thinking what a crazy question that was. She came in breathless. When I told you to open, I didn't think you'd upstage us. I didn't know what I was doing. The doorman didn't even look at me when I told him I was in the band. He just kinda grunted. Brun came to a dead stop when he saw you. I had to cover his eyes and guide him down. "The stage, where is he?" "Setting up his drums." "Of course, are you ready?" "I think I'm going to switch to Gus. That was my old guitar. Yes, I named him when I was 16 and Gus the guitar. That might be best. I don't think I want to share the stage with that thing. It would be like singing a duet with Arthur Franklin or something." A knock sounded on the door. Lizzie cracked it open and peeked out. "There's a guy here from the meme. Says he wants to talk to the king in yellow." The manager said, "Who? Yeah, send him in." Lizzie gaped at me, then rolled her eyes. In walked a slick guy in designer jeans and professionally styled sideburns. He glanced at me. "Are you the king in yellow? Let's say I speak for him." I said, "In case HTR was listening, I want to book you for the meme this Saturday." "Saturday." Lizzie gaped. Saturdays at the meme were for bands with record contracts, professional musicians on the tier below Arena Rock. There are 3 crying girls in the lobby right now while the bouncer calls them a cab. Mr. Slick said the doorman just walked off the job saying he was going to do something with his life while he still had a chance. The bartender can't sell drinks fast enough. You weren't playing anywhere else between now and then. "You know," I said, "I know a guy in Colombia. I'm going to call him and he's going to sign you, but he's going to sign you at the meme. You're going to be discovered at the meme. Understand? I need an advance of $700, I said. I was as astonished as everyone else at the words coming out of my mouth. The man chuckled uneasily. "Don't get cocky. Columbia will be happy to throw money at you, but first you've got to do the show. I need an advance of $700 to do the show," my voice said again. Then, since I was talking so cool, I decided to act cool too. I picked up Gus and turned to Lizzie. "You ready to go on? Wait," the man barked. He took out his cell phone. "Yeah. Hi, Cindy. This is Mark. Listen, a guy is going to come by the club tomorrow morning and call himself the King in Yellow. I want you to give him $700 in cash. I'll take care of that when I get there. Hang on." He looked at me. "What time will you be there?" 1 in the afternoon. "That's right." He hung up the phone and glared at me. "All right, you can take your 1700s and head off for Mexico if you like. Or you can show up Saturday, play my show, and walk into the life of a rock star. Your choice." He walked out, leaving me with Lizzie staring at me like I had betrayed her like all this time. I'd been pretending to be a regular person, and now it turned out I was secretly a god. She thought we were friends, but she was only a stepping stool to start him. She said she looked on the verge of tears. Come with me. It doesn't have to be a solo act. I probably need some help out there. She shook her head. I think I'd only hold you back. Come on, if this is going to be the last show for the Catholic Circus, let's make it a good one. It wasn't. Our heart wasn't in it. Bruin was able to fit himself in well enough, but it wasn't like having a real drummer. He couldn't add to the songs. Leslie was heartbroken. I was confused. If we'd been any other band, we'd probably have been booed off the stage. But with Catholic Circus, well, Lise was able to leverage the heartbreak into our songs easily enough, so we held it together after the first set. I thought about getting out H-tier again, but I didn't dare. I didn't think he'd want to share the stage either the next day. I collected my $700 in cash and headed back to the pawn shop, pastor in hand, just to keep him from asking for even more money. I kept $500 in my wallet and another $500 in my sock. I didn't doubt he would ask for as much as he thought he could get, but I thought $700 in my fist was enough to stave off homicide, and we could bicker about the rest. The pawn shop was gone. I don't mean it was closed, it was gone. The stone facade still stood through the shattered windows. I could see charred timbers and a few metal remains. There was a metal ladder bent out of shape by the heat of the fire, balanced on the blackened floor. Joyce's yellow police tape stretched across the windows and warned everyone to stay out. I stopped in at the flower shop next door and asked the lady there good riddance too. He made the whole block creepy. How did it happen, arson? They think he probably said it himself to collect the insurance money. The police picked him up in Mexico. He won't see a dime. The lady wanted to say more about the intelligence of someone who tries to pull off an insurance scam while simultaneously skipping the country. But I had to check one thing. Fire burns up. It was possible, unlikely, but possible that the amp was still there in the basement. Unscathed, I parted the police tape and climbed through the window into the burned-out shop. There wasn't much floor left. I kept my feet on the joist and hoped they were sound. The sun was high in the sky, and I could see down into the basement. Well enough, it was piled with litter of half-bird boards, globes of melted glass, various metal things that had fallen through the floor. Plenty of burning things had landed in the basement. But there was the hulking old furnace. There was the freezer chest scorched and pitted but not warped out of shape. There was a pile of ash and junk that might be covering the amplifier. The stairs to the basement were still in place, but they were so black and alligator, I worried that they were mostly charcoal. Stepped from joist to joist until I got to the aluminum ladder, slightly twisted, but it seemed sound. I yeeted between two joists and jammed it against the junk in the floor. It was so bent there was no way to brace it at all. Four corners. I got both feet on the floor and one side of the top braced and called it good enough. I held tight to a joist as long as I could, just in case, but it got me to the bottom, intact. A cloud of ash floated up around me. I floundered across the wreckage, flung aside the frame of a flexible flyer and a broken panel of sheetrock, and there it was, unburnt, undamaged. Barely a scorch mark on her. Getting the amp out of the basement was an ordeal. It might have been possible to pass it between the floor joist, but it was so big and heavy. I knew the odds were better. I'd just drop it and shatter the irreplaceable tubes in the end. I decided to chance the stairs after all. If I fell through and killed myself, it wouldn't matter that I wrecked the amp. But I got it out. There's nothing left to tell but the music concert. The meme was not very crowded that night, maybe 100 folks, including the guy from Colombia. I walked out on stage, the yellow scarf around my face, and I began to play. I noticed the screaming first one, then others. People threw their arms over their faces, covering their ears. It didn't make any difference. They fled for the exits. So many at once they ran into each other. The first probably made it out, but when they jammed in the doors, others tried to climb over them, trampling, crushing, tearing. I saw one man try to smash through the wall with his head. Either that or he was trying to kill himself. I could no more have stopped playing than grow wings and fly somewhere along there. The tentacles began to reach through. I think they first came out of the storm sewers, but in parts of Boston, the storm sewers connect with the municipal sewage. So soon they burst out of the drains and restrooms and basements. By the time they were reaching into the concert hall, most of the people were already dead. The remainder were pulled apart and disappeared into an engulfing mass. The bartender had climbed up to the top shelf and started a fire by throwing a bottle of 51 at the hot grill. Then he threw more liquor at the flames until the whole bar was burning. He kept the tentacles away until he had roasted himself. Then all at once the guitar ceased to exist. Frets and strings and wires sprang free and clattered about my feet. I had control of my body once again, but I knew what this meant. From every sewer grate and the shapeless mass was oozing. The terrible deed was done. Pasta was in the world. I escaped out the backstage door and ran. I don't need to tell you more. You've heard it from 1,000 other voices. The only curious question is why or how I survived when I was there at the center of the maelstrom where it all began. Why wasn't I eaten? Why didn't I perish in the fires? Why am I still at least somewhat sane? Was it some reward, some expression of gratitude that I was spared? I doubt it. What use has hate ear for gratitude? I think rather the opposite. It was his exquisite torture for me, no matter where I run to. No matter how I hide, I hear the news, another city fall into madness and fire, more tentacles reaching out of the sea, nuclear missiles annihilating the survivors if there are any, but never slowing the inexorable spread of destruction. I hear the news and know it was my hand that made it happen. Even if I hadn't been in control of them, I tried to find Lizzie, my doubt. She made it out of Boston. Hardly anyone did, but in case she is alive somewhere, that's not her real name. I don't want anyone killing her for association with me. The only question left is whether HSTR will bore of planet Earth before he has exterminated the human race. I think there's a chance of that to pursue us until the last one is dead. Would take a real dedication to the cause. I don't think he cares enough about humans to bother kids. May have fun burning ants with a magnifying glass, but even the meanest kid doesn't dig up the nest and hunt until he's sure every last ant is dead. No, there are other nests, other worlds to destroy. I hear England is burning. Oceans are no barrier, and he's not bored yet. The room's pulse was a weight, its whispers a truth that lingered in my fate, a truth that followed me to the ruin. Story number 2, Legends of the Fading Oasis. The air hummed with a stillness no peace should hold, its currents weaving secrets through the dim camp, its hush pulsing with an unseen and rhythm. I sat by the fire, the ground creaking with a scent I couldn't place, earth, smoke, something distant, something that clung to my breath, something that knew my intrigue. The space stretched, its edges bending as if the night was alive, its breath a whisper I couldn't ignore. I was no stranger to tolls, but this was different. This was a truth that stirred in the shadows. The hum deepened, a vibration threading through the air, a sound that wasn't mine. The faint glow of flames flickered, casting shadows that danced like memories, their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling on the ground, but the shadows faded, the light dimming, the silence heavier. The camp wasn't empty, it was full, brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. Urged, I ventured deeper, the space stretching ahead, its surface bending as if the night was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick with a weight that pressed against my chest. A weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine. It belonged to something else, something that stirred in the stillness, something that knew I was here. The vibration intensified, the ground's pulse a drumbeat under my feet, its silence a predator. I carried my curiosity, a frail shield against the unknown, but the air disagreed, its presence alive with mystery. I was a seeker, a witness, marked by a secret I couldn't annul. The breeze, the canvas of the lives, spent and lost its edges, holding echoes of those who'd traveled here, those who'd never left. I was no stranger to wonder, but this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. It was a long time ago that I heard the tale. I was deep in the desert with only myself and a man I had hired as a guide. He found a small oasis at the bottom of a valley and set up camp. For the evening, later that night, under a moonless sky, we sat around the campfire. My guide was carving something from a piece of wood while I stared out into the desert. "Do you know of any good campfire stories?" I asked. He looked at me from across the campfire for a moment with his bright blue eyes and then gazed into the fire. He nodded. "There is one, I know." He said, "It is a very old story and not one that many people know well. Let's hear it then." I said, "Preferably before the campfire goes out." He smiled at me and began to tell his tale. Millennia ago, there stood in the desert the great and ancient city of Zaytan, Natas, the Isis Seti, home to tens of thousands. It was beautiful in the sunlight, with its polished sandstone buildings shining brilliantly. Its streets were full of life and color, with merchants shouting at the pedestrian, the children running through the courtyards, and the priests and scribes going about their business. The buildings everywhere were adorned with garishly colored tapestries and murals, most including the golden frond, the symbol of the oasis city. Brightly painted statues stood guard at all gates, and on the corners of the temples, each of the city's quarters held a massive fountain spraying water high into the air. At the center of all of the roads was the Tower of the Moon, rising into the sky above the city. At its base stood the great crypt, the sanctuary of the priesthood, and the heart of Nas. A high and impenetrable wall surrounded it all in a near-perfect circle. But things were far from perfect in that ancient city. Just before sunrise, on the night of every new moon, a young hunter named Azar climbed onto his roof to view the monthly spectacle as the first light of dawn came over the horizon. All activity in the city ceased. The streets were empty. The people and their homes stayed silent, and then came the sound of slang from the great crypt. It was a faint sound, but unmistakable. Every citizen of Zaton-Natas claimed that they could hear it when it happened. And then the locked doors of the great crypt opened, and 4 high priests carried out a large stone sarcophagus, emblazoned with the golden frond and the black sun, the sign of the goddess, while all others hid in their homes for the duration of the ceremony, peeking out of their windows if they were brave. Azar crouched on his rooftop and watched them as they went from the center of the city to the southern gate. For 5 years, the ceremony had been carried out. An old legend had stated that the city was under the protection of a goddess. One day, it said, a demon would come to destroy the city. On that day, the goddess would come, banish the demon, and usher in a golden age for Zaton-Natas. But the demon had come, and the goddess had not. The high priest slew the demon using ancient and forbidden magic, but its heart refused to die. They ripped the organ from its body, but a new body began to slowly grow around the heart. They could not destroy it, nor could they dispose of it, so they placed it in the deepest shrine of the great crypt and sealed the doors. Then they returned every month when the demon was nearly regenerated and cut out its heart. Once again, then they placed the husk in a sarcophagus and carried it to the pit of Zacchus, which was said to be the entrance to the underworld, and threw the lifeless body into it, coffin and all, and thus the high priest claimed they protected the city until the goddess came to destroy the demon once and for all. The camp's pulse was a spark, its whispers a truth that lingered in my intrigue, a truth that followed me to the tale. The air trembled with a breath no calm should hold, its currents weaving secrets through the dim valley, its hush pulsing with an unseen rhythm. I stood by the spring, the ground creaking with a scent I couldn't place. Water, stunning, something ancient, something that clung to my breath, something that knew my unease. The space stretched, its edges bending as if the earth was alive, its breath a whisper I couldn't ignore. I was no stranger to exploration, but this was different. This was a truth that stirred the shadows. The weight deepened, a vibration threading through the air, a sound that wasn't mine. The faint torchlight flickered, casting shadows that danced like visions, their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling on the water, but the shadows faded, the light dimming, the silence heavier. The valley wasn't empty, it was full, brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. I ventured deeper, the space stretching ahead, its surface bending as if the earth was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick with a weight that pressed against my chest, a weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine. It belonged to something else, something that stirred in the stillness, something that knew I was here. The vibration intensified, the ground's pulse a drumbeat under my feet. Its Akinid's a predator. I carried my wonder, a frail shield against the unknown, but the air disagreed, its presence alive with mystery. I was a seeker, a witness, marked by a secret I couldn't unknow. The breeze sighed. The valley a canvas of lives, it had lost, its edges holding echoes of those who'd wandered here, those who'd never left. I was no stranger to mystery, but this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. The people of Zayton and Nas claimed that it was their golden age. They claimed that the demon was defeated. Asser called that heresy to all that would listen. He made his case. Asser was a man of faith that believed the prophecy must be followed precisely until the goddess destroyed the demon. He said the golden age would not truly come, and for the goddess to appear, the demon must be let loose upon the world. His friends laughed at first. They tried to persuade him otherwise. Failing at that, they turned their backs on him. At last, Ather called them blind. He said that their golden age was a farce. He had watched the city for many years, and he had seen the rot beginning to set in over it. It began with the high priest beneath the banner of the black sun. They claimed that they were above all others in the oasis city. They began to amass wealth, servants, and power beyond compare. He had heard rumors of them stealing from the city vaults and claiming it for the temple. He had seen them take young women from their families to fulfill their own desires, and he had seen any who stood against them disappear as if they never existed. The city had fallen into ruin, with its funds depleted. Violence, crime, and corruption had taken hold. But the people claimed that the golden age was upon them because they did not want to believe what was directly in front of them. At noon, on the days of slaying, the doors of the great crypt stood open, and the priests flaunted their power, for on display on the great altar, for 1 hour, was the heart that they had ripped out of the demon's chest. It beat slowly as the bravest citizens viewed it, and at the end of the hour, the veins and arteries began to sprout once again, and the people of the city were banished from the crypt until the next day of slaying, as viewed it every time he was drawn to it. At times, he thought he could almost hear a voice in the air, pleading with him to free it from its torment. And one day, as the voice was clearer than it had ever been, Aer finally decided to take action. He would unleash the demon for 1 month. He planned how he would do it. He could not merely stop the slaying. The doors of the great crypt had powerful seals upon them, and even if he could gain entry, how long would it be before the demon awoke? No, his course of action had to be more precise. He must rejoin the body and heart. He knew the course of the priest, transporting the husk to the pit of Zacchus along the way. There was a large boulder that had been there since before the first stone of Zayton. Nas was laid. It was there that he must wait. He readied his bow, which he had practiced with since he was a small child. His aim was near perfect. He let out his arrows and performed certain rituals and blessings over them. saying that what blood they spilled would be for the greater good. And so, the next day of slaying came Asser had hidden behind the great boulder a day before. In camp there, he had no fear of being discovered, for none but the holy men with their load traveled. Toward the pit of Zacchus, dawn came and the city went silent. And despite being half a mile from the city, gates Asser heard the sound of slaying. Over the years he had come to know the exact timing and pace of the high priest, traveling with the great stone sarcophagus. So he waited, knowing exactly when they would cross in front of the boulder, and exactly when he expected he heard footfalls on the other side of his refuge. The valley's pulse was a weight, its whispers a truth that lingered in my unease, a truth that followed me to the ambush. The air swelled with a pressure no resolve should bear, its currents weaving secrets through the dim crypt, its hush pulsing with an unseen rhythm. I imagined the scene, the ground creaking with a scent I couldn't place. Stone, blood, something ancient, something that clung to my breath, something that knew my dread. The space stretched, its edges bending as if the walls were alive, its breath a whisper couldn't ignore. Was no stranger to faith, but this was different. This was a truth that stirred in the shadows. The pressure deepened, a vibration threading through the air, a sound that wasn't mine. The faint torchlight flickered, casting shadows that danced like visions, their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling in the air, but the shadows faded, the light dimming, the silence heavier. The crypt wasn't empty, it was full, brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. I ventured deeper, the space stretching ahead, its surface bending as if the crypt was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick with a weight that pressed against my chest, a weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine. It belonged to something else, something that stirred in the stillness, something that knew I was here. The vibration intensified, the ground's pulse a drumbeat under my feet, its silence a predator. I carried my conviction, a frail shield against the unknown, but the air disagreed, its presence alive with mystery. I was a seeker, a witness, marked by a secret I couldn't unknow. The breeze sighed, the crypt a canvas of lives spent and lost, its edges holding echoes of those who'd prayed here, those who'd never left. I was no stranger to sacrifice, but this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. He circled the stone quietly, so that he came around the road behind them as he moved onto the road. He saw them walking slowly ahead of him with their backs turned. He drew his bow and aimed for the priest to the front, and right the farthest away from him. His years of training had served him well, for the arrow found its target in the back of the priest's head. The other three staggered as one edge of the sarcophagus was no longer held. Oft, Aer drew his next shot and fired at the priest on the back right. The arrow struck him in the back, and he fell with that. The sarcophagus tumbled to the right, its side slamming into the dirt path. Its heavy stone lid loosened and fell to the ground. Its contents struck the side with a dull thud. By now the remaining priests had turned and seen him. They drew their ceremonial blades and charged before the nearest could reach him. Aser had buried an arrow in his throat as the last man ran at him. Aser drew and fired his fourth arrow, and then something happened. That did not happen often. He missed with the priest almost upon him. Aer panicked and quickly drew another arrow. He rushed the shot and fired wildly, missing the priest again. With that, the man was upon him, swinging the razor-sharp blade towards his head. Aser raised his bow to block the strike. The blade cut effortlessly through the thick wood, but missed its mark and buried itself in Aster's shoulder. He screamed in pain and watched as his blood began to soak the sand beneath him. For a moment, he waited, expecting the strike that would cut his throat, but it did not come. He raised his head and saw that the priest was exhausted. It had been years since he had had to act so swiftly. Aser took his chance and knocked the sword from the man's grasp, acting on instinct. He pulled the man to the ground and leapt on top of him, his hands going to his throat. For what seemed like an eternity, he choked him until the man finally stopped moving. Aser rose to his feet, panicked and grasping for breath. His killing of the others was sanctified by the blessed arrows. This was cold-blooded murder. His soul was now forfeit. After a minute of panic, he calmed himself by remembering his goal. Surely, if he heralded it in the true golden age, he would be redeemed. He approached the fallen sarcophagus, its lid lying silently on the ground beside it. He prepared himself to gaze upon an abomination and looked inside of the stone coffin. What was inside was not what he expected. What was inside terrified him more than anything else on earth ever could. After many minutes of staring, he carefully gathered up the contents in a large burlap sack, painfully hefted them over his good shoulder, and ran back towards Zan-Naz. For hours, he hid in a darkened alley with his prize. It seemed like an eternity. Finally, he saw the sunrise directly above him, and he knew it was time. The priests would not be suspicious at first, for Aer was already present at the displaying of the heart. His plan to retrieve the heart had been subtle and complex, but for all those hours of waiting, rage had festered inside his heart. He would not draw it out 1 second more than was necessary. It was then that he heard a loud crack and knew that the doors of the great crypt had been unsealed. He threw his burden over his right shoulder once more and marched toward the crypt. As he reached the doors, he saw that a priest was pulling each of the doors open. One of them smiled as they saw Aser, for they had seen him every new moon for years. His smile faded as he saw the bag draped over his shoulder as Aser reached the doors. He shoved the left door as hard as he could. The door struck the priest, and he fell onto his back, clutching his face when the priest on the right protested. Aster swung around one end of the heavy sack on his shoulder, striking the man in the face and sending him to the ground as well. The ceiling of the CP towered high above him, the sunlight filtering in through small windows. He strode through the towering statues surrounding him, toward the great altar in the center of the room. 2 priests were present, one on each side of the altar. Upon hearing the noise at the entrance, they had drawn their blades. Asa let the bag he carried fall to the floor with a sickening noise of dead flesh. The priest charged at him, but Aser was ready. This time he knew their aim would be poor, and that they had no strength to their blows. He grabbed the wrist of the first to reach him and wrenched it until the blade dropped from his grasp. He placed a hand on the man's chest and shoved him into the second priest. They fell to the floor screaming. Aster saw red and knew that the second man's blade must have cut one or both of them. He didn't care. Aster stepped around the two men on the floor and made his way to the great altar. In the center of the room, the light from the windows above made the golden altar shine brilliantly. But what Aster wanted was the lump of dull flesh sitting on top of it. A shudder ran through him as he picked the heart up. Off the altar, the beating was slow and faint, but there, nonetheless, Aer closed his eyes and began to silently mouth a prayer. Before he could finish it, a hand roughly grabbed his wounded shoulder from behind his arm, exploded in pain as he was spun around. Opening his eyes, he saw a large man clad in leather armor. Towering above him, the dull leather was emblazoned with the symbol of the black sun. The crypt's pulse was a weight, its whispers a truth that lingered in my dread, a truth that followed me to the altar. The air groaned with a tension no faith should bear, its currents weaving secrets through the dim study, its hush pulsing with an unseen rhythm. I envisioned the scene, the floor creaking with a scent I couldn't place. Wood, shadow, something ancient, something that clung to my breath, something that knew my fear. The space stretched, its edges bending as if the walls were alive, its breath a whisper I couldn't ignore. I was no stranger to conflict, but this was different. This was a truth that stirred in the shadows. The groan deepened, a vibration threading through the air, a sound that wasn't mine. The faint torchlight flickered, casting shadows that danced like visions. Their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling in the air. But the shadows faded, the light dimming, the silence heavier. The study wasn't empty. It was full, brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. I ventured deeper, the space stretching ahead, its surface bending as if the study was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick, with a weight that pressed against my chest, a weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine. It belonged to something else, something that stirred in the stillness, something that knew I was here. The vibration intensified, the floor's pulse a drumbeat under my feet, its silence a predator. I carried my resolve, a frail shield against the unknown, but the air disagreed, its presence alive with mystery. I was a seeker, a witness, marked by a secret I couldn't unknow. The breeze did. The study, a canvas of lives spent and lost, its edges holding echoes of those who'd schemed here, those who'd never left. I was no stranger to doubt, but this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. Acer had little time to react as a heavy fist struck him in the face and everything faded to black. Acer awoke in a room the likes of which he had never seen before. He had been seated in a heavy wooden chair. He did not seem to be bound in any way. In front of him stood a tall central stand containing a dimly burning torch. The light cut through the darkness around him, casting strange shadows on the walls. This was unsettling, as Acer could see nothing between the torch and the walls that could be casting the shadows. The walls were covered in paintings that may have looked normal in the light, but underneath the dim light and shadows, there was not one of them that did not look demonic. Graceful figures became twisted and scarred beneath him. On the floor was a carpet made from the hides of animals he did not recognize. Several seconds after he awoke, he heard a door open behind him. Soft footsteps approached his back, and he heard a low voice. "I presume that my personal study might give us a bit more privacy than the cells in the dungeon," the voice said. A tall man clad in the same branded armor walked in front of him. He turned and stood directly between Asser and the torch, his figure silhouetted against the dim light. At his back, Asser could make out nothing about his face except for a pair of flashing blue eyes that stared back at him. "Allow me to introduce myself," said the strange man. "I am Sukkez, head of the Guardians of the Priesthood. You won't have heard of us, of course. We take care to make sure of that. We find it makes our job easier." As Aster's head fully cleared, the rage returned stronger than before. "What have you done?" Aster said in a low growl. "I have done nothing," said Sukkez. "You, on the other hand, have committed several acts of murder, put the people of the city into a panic, and almost ruined many years of hard work." "You know what I mean?" said. "What was that?" The rage was evident in his voice. He saw a flash of white as Sukkez grinned at him. "Ah, you mean what was in the sarcophagus. But you don't need me to tell you that you knew the moment you saw it, whether you want to believe it or not." E.R. thought back to the hours before when he gazed into the great stone coffin. There was a corpse inside, but it was no demon. It was the body of a woman. She was tall, beautiful, and regal. He had seen the skin of the body shine faintly, bathing the inside of the sarcophagus with light. Asser said his next word slowly and deliberately, rage permeating every syllable. "You slaughter to God." "Yes," repeatedly said Sukkez as Lee from the chair. He was seated in his hands, going for Sukkaz's throat. As soon as he had risen, the man's fist crashed directly into his jaw. He fell back onto the chair, painfully tasting blood and feeling that 2 teeth were missing from the right side of his jaw. "Do not think you can kill me as easily as a few pampered high priests. Luck has been on your side this far. It will not be again." Aster drew himself back up in the chair, but remained seated. He glared back at the man in front of him, tears beginning to well up in his eyes. "How in the name of that is only can you do such a thing?" asked Asser, his voice nearly breaking. "To be fair," said Sukkez with a maddened tone of superiority, "I have never killed her myself. You can credit your illustrious priesthood with that. As for why they do it, because of the one thing that drives all men, and that is fear," said Sukkez. 5 years ago, the high priest began to descend into a state of arrogance and decadence. They began to amass power, created the guardians, and robbed the city blind. And then she appeared, the very goddess these priests claimed to work on behalf of and on. That day, those men that once thought themselves righteous feared judgment. More than any, Sukkez laughed softly. I'm not sure who struck the blow, but before she could say one word to them, a priest drew his blade and impaled her through the heart. Then they saw the blood withdraw and the wound begin to heal. They had been afraid of judgment for their pride. Now they were petrified of judgment for the murder of a deity. And so the cycle began. The study's pulse was a weight. Its whispers, a truth that lingered in my fear, a truth that followed me to the revelation. The air faded with a silence no hope should endure, its currents weaving secrets through the dim valley, its hush pulsing with an unseen rhythm. I stood by the spring, the ground creaking with a scent I couldn't place. Water, shadow, something ancient, something that clung to my soul, something that knew my fate. The space stretched, its edges bending as if the earth was alive, its breath a whisper I couldn't ignore. I was no stranger to endings, but this was different. This was a truth that stirred in the shadows. The silence deepened, a vibration threading through the air, a sound that wasn't mine. The faint torchlight flickered, casting shadows that danced like memories, their forms elusive, their presence felt. I blinked, my heart a drum, my breath catching, my hand trembling on the water, but the shadows faded, the light dimming, the silence heavier. The valley wasn't empty, it was full, brimming with a presence I couldn't name, a truth I couldn't flee. I glanced back, the space stretching behind, its surface bending as if the earth was watching, waiting. The air grew denser, thick with a weight that pressed against my mind, a weight that followed me, a weight that refused to lift. The space wasn't mine. It belonged to something else, something that stirred in the stillness, something that knew I was here. The vibration intensified, the ground's pulse a drumbeat under my breath, its silence a predator. I carried my resolve, a frail shield against the unknown, but the air disagreed, its presence alive with mystery. I was a seeker, a witness, marked by a secret I couldn't unknow. The breeze vanished, the valley a canvas of leaves, spent and lost, its edges holding echoes of those who'd wandered here, those who'd never left. I was no stranger to legacy, but this was alive, a truth I couldn't escape. The space was a witness, a keeper of shadows, a truth that held me, a truth that shaped me, a truth I couldn't shake. 5 years, said Acer. 5 years. How many times has it been? How many corpses have been thrown into the pit? Why do they let this continue? He was sure that someone outside would hear his screams, but Sukas just stood there and let him continue. When he finally stopped, the man laughed. Your people are cowards, said Sukas. They cannot face what they see in front of them. Their city could be burning around them and they would not notice. The city is burning, screamed Sukas. And you know it. How do you let this happen day in and day out? Because the world may be better off with it. Gone. The oasis city is dead and rotten. It must be cut off like a gangrenous limb. The man's tone changed as he said those words. Words his voice echoed from the walls around them. Air's rage began to dim. Fear began to replace it. Who are you? Acer asked, his voice lowered to a whisper. Sukas crossed his arms and looked up toward the ceiling as if trying to find the correct words to say. After a few seconds, he circled the torch in the center of the room until he came to a stop on the side opposite Acer. Turning towards Acer, he could see Suk's face at last. It seemed completely normal, with short dark hair and a thin pointed beard. Then Acer saw the shadow being cast behind him, though Sukas was only slightly taller than Acer. The shadow loomed high above them. Both the shadow's head appeared to have several horns jutting off of it at odd angles. Massive wings stretched to its sides, covering the entire wall. With the darkness, Sokka saw Aster's eyes go wide. He grinned and circled back around to the front of the torch. "I am someone who is very much above the people of this city. You're the demon of legend." Sukas chuckled, the sound ringing off the walls. "Demon? No," said Sukas, shaking his head. "I prefer to see myself as more of an angel, one with a very specific purpose." "Destruction," said Aser. "Change," said Sukas. "Nothing lasts forever in this world. To try to do so is folly." He moved closer to Aser, who cowered in his seat. "All men die, all cities fall to ruin, and all empires crumble. It is the natural order of things. Your city, your goddess, and your people try to work against nature itself. It wasn't all the priests. Was it?" asked Aer, find in some small semblance of courage. "That depends," said Sukas, the tone of superiority coming back into his voice. "I may have started their decline into corruption. I may have caused them to doubt their beliefs, and I may have implanted their fear of their goddess. But I did not draw that blade, and I have not touched her." "You won't get away with this," said Aser, his voice finally confident once again. "I won't let you do this. The goddess will live again. Suas tilted his head to one side and looked silently at Aser, a questioning look in his eyes. "Very well, you are free to go." Aster's jaw dropped, and a dumbfounded look came onto his face. "Really? You're not going to imprison me? Kill me, would you like me to?" asked Suas. Aser stared back silently. "No, my friend, it is not my place to kill you. My purpose is to bring ruin. Perhaps yours is to bring ruin to me. Who am I to interfere with the machinations of fate?" Ghost still staring at the man in front of him. Acer slowly got up from the chair with a great deal of fear. He turned his back on the man and started toward the door behind him. "However, you may not want to go through with this." Aer stopped in his tracks. 2 steps from the door, he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He did not want to listen to what the demon had to say, but something made him turn around. "What do you mean by that?" asked Acer. Sukos had moved back around to the other side of the torch in the center of the room. The massive shadow was invisible once again on the far wall. Steeling himself, Acer walked to the torch, glaring at Sukos from directly across. "I just mean that should you follow this course of action, the results may be much worse than you anticipate. What might seem like the right thing to do may be anything, but do not try to fool me," said Aer. "You cannot see the future, perhaps not. But I have watched this world for far longer than you can imagine, and I have become quite adept at guessing the outcome of things. Would you like to see what the future has in store for the first time since he began his quest?" Doubt began to slip into Aster's mind. He tried to remind himself. That was exactly what the demon was trying to do, but that slight twinge of doubt began to grow. Aer found himself unable to resist. "All right, demon," said Acer, "what can you tell me of my quest?" Zukas grinned more broadly than ever as the words left Aster's lips. "I prefer to show you." The man waved a hand over the torch in the center of the room, and it was extinguished. Fear gripped Acer as the darkness enveloped him. Then from above him a light appeared. He looked up and saw that it was the moon high overhead. Looking back to the floor, he saw a forest laid out before him. He heard Sukas clearing his throat behind him and spun around. Acer found himself on the top of a high ridge looking down on Zayton Nass from miles away. Sukas stood on the very precipice. "What will happen when the goddess lives again?" asked Sukas. "Is it not possible that her wrath will be great with that?" A brilliant light appeared in the sky above the city. A massive glowing orb hung ominously over Zayton. "Nas, is it not possible that the city will pay the price?" The orb descended in a split second, striking the center of the city. A flash of light struck Aster's eyes, and he had to cover them. Moments later, he felt a shock wave wash over him. Uncovering his eyes, he saw that a dozen more of the orbs had appeared above the city and were beginning to descend. Forcing himself to look into the light, he saw blast after blast tear the city apart. Houses were thrown high into the air. The great statues were blown to dust. He saw the tower of the moon shatter and fall. But why stop there? Will her wrath not be great enough to punish the world of men as a whole? The entire sky was suddenly alight with the mass of orbs. They began to move outward, traveling toward the far eastern cities and the coastal cities of the north. Would you watch the world burn just for your hope? The great orb nearest to them in the sky began to descend directly towards Acer. In seconds, the light had engulfed him, and he could see nothing. Acer steeled himself, closing his eyes, and tried to ignore the vision before him. "That will not happen," said Aster. "Our goddess is merciful and just. She would never punish those who have not wronged her." His voice was confident, but in his mind the seed of doubt began to grow. "Lar." After a moment, Suka spoke again through the light. "Perhaps," he said, "so let us assume you are right, and that your goddess is not the wrathful sort. Let us assume that your beloved golden age does indeed come after my demise." The light around Acer dimmed and began to flicker. He slowly opened his eyes and looked around him. He was in the battered husk of a city. Tall wooden houses burned around him. The air was heavy with smoke. Ash lined the street. Suka still stood in front of him on the broken street. "Where are we now?" asked Basser Suka. "Shrugged one of the eastern cities," he said, "Stead, or Laria, or H, or one of the others. I cannot remember." Sukos bent down and grabbed a handful of ash as he spoke. He let it sift through his fingers and let it drift away in the searing wind. "Your golden age comes, but your city's ride does not disappear. It only grows." Sukas turned and began to walk up the road, stepping over burning debris. Esther hurried after him. He felt his feet sink into the hot ash. He could not help but wonder where all the people were. Perhaps the vision was not complete. They began to see themselves as superior to those around them. Said Sukas, they are ruled over by a living deity, and they feel that they have the divine right to rule over these other pathetic cities, the armies of Satan. Nas march on them all and burn them to the ground. The two of them finally came to a great courtyard. Acer moved ahead of Sukas and saw that the paved area had been ripped apart and that great pits had been dug into the earth. Moving towards one, he saw that it was not a pit, but a mass grave. and charred skeletons filled the pit to its very brim. He saw movement at the center of the courtyard, and his attention was torn away from the bodies. The smoke cleared, and he could see a banner flying proudly. It was blooded and torn, but the symbol of the black sun could still be seen, and blazoned on it, "What once inspired faith will now only instill fear," said Sukas. Aser felt rage begin to boil up inside him, but he could not tell what it was directed at. Was it at the men of this future? Suaz himself no, screamed Aser. "The people of Zayton Naz would never do this. I have lived there my entire life and have never once doubted that they were good people. You still believe that after knowing what has transpired there for 5 years?" asked Sukas. "Your naivety is amusing if nothing else. I must say, even if our leaders have fallen to corruption, the people will." "Not said, Aser." Sukas smirked and shook his head. "So once again let us presume you are right. Your precious people are faultless, and they spend their golden age doing wholesome, peaceful things." Acer struggled to keep a calm facade in response to Suka's mocking tone. "Do you trust the people of the surrounding cities?" Just as much as he spoke the words, the city around them blurred and changed. The sound of flames died down and was replaced with another sound metal, striking metal. "The men of the surrounding cities see your great wealth and power, and as always happens, they are filled with envy and fear. They will try to crush you." As the scene around him finally stopped shifting, Acer found him and Sukas standing in the market quarter of Zayton Naz. Beneath one of the great fountains, the water ran red among them. Soldiers fought madly. The guards of Zayton Naz were outnumbered and outmatched, but they struggled on more, falling each second. The soldiers attacking them had many different sigils on their armor. "They will succeed," said Sukas. He motioned for Acer to look behind him. Acer did so, and saw the body of the goddess. Once again her heart was removed, and the body had been decapitated. Acer fell to his knees, seeing the streets of the oasis city full of death. He closed his eyes and lowered his face into his hands. The noise around him fell silent. He looked up and found himself in Sukaz's study. Once again the torch shining dimly from its stand, Acer felt his head spinning. Sukas stood over him, arms crossed, awaiting a response. Acer met his gaze, glaring back into the bright blue eyes. He rose to his feet and took a deep breath. "So," said Sukas, "what is your course of action now?" It was almost a minute before Asa replied, "I believe in the goddess. I believe in the city of Zayton Naz, and I believe in all people. I will see your downfall, demon, no matter the cost." There was no trace of uncertainty in his voice. There was not even any rage. There was only a conviction that brought a look of shock to Suk's face. Acer's shoved Sukas away from him and went for the door. "Stop," said Sukos. Aster sighed and waited, keeping his back to him. "Gonna kill me now?" he asked. He heard Suk's footsteps approach his back. "No," said Sukos, "I'm not going to be that kind." "Then what do you want?" asked Acer. He felt Suk's breath on the back of his neck. "You have seen what could happen," whispered Sukas, "but now you must know what will happen." Acer remained silent. "I gave you a chance to stop your fool's crusade and live out your days in peace, the same way I gave your priests a chance to save themselves and repent. But they failed to take it, and now so have you. I will not listen to more of your lies, demon, than listen to the truth, said Sukas, his voice raising. You will go and tell the people of me and your high priest, and do you know what they will do? They will call you mad and neurotic, and they will take you and lock you away in the tower of the moon in a tiny cell with one tiny window. And every new moon, you will look out that window and wonder if it is finally the day that the high priest break the cycle and release your precious goddess. And that day will never come. AER closed his eyes and focused his thoughts inward, ignoring Sukas, whose voice rose with every word. You will watch your city travel the road to destruction. You will live out your life in that cell, waiting for the day to come. And on your deathbed, you will finally know that that day will never come. Sukas grabbed Aster by the shoulder and spun him around, screaming directly into his face. Where will your faith be? Then Sukas finally fell silent. Aster reached up and removed his hand from his shoulder. He looked back into the demon's eyes and smiled, the same place it has always been said. Aster Sukas glared back and returned the smile. You think you will be rewarded in death as a martyr, said Sukas, but you do not know the truth. She is not a goddess. She is Satan, Nas, the very soul of the oasis city. With every day of slaying the city, decays brick by brick, and when enough bodies have been cast into the pit, your precious city will collapse under the weight of its own pride. You'll have no deity to put faith in. Asa remained silent for a moment when he spoke again. Sukas heard something change. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I have learned something here today, Sukas said. Asa, I thank you, I really do, because if Satan Nas is only a city, then there is only one thing left to place my faith in. I believe in the people, and if this city does fall, one day the people will survive it, and you will know that you have failed. Where will your pride be? Then Sukas said nothing as Asa turned and left the room. At last, Sukas thought quietly for a moment and then smirked. Good luck and of faith, he said. You will need it. The torch went out and the room descended back into darkness. My guide stopped talking and began carving. Once again, I waited a minute for him to resume before speaking. Well, I asked what happened. Then he looked up at me and smiled. There are no records that still remain from that ancient city, he said. I sighed and got up from the campfire. I grabbed a torch and stuck it into the fire. After lighting it, I walked toward the spring, a short walk away from our camp. I kept talking as I walked away. So, do you think the place even existed? I asked. There are certain relics that have been found that supposedly come from the oasis city. I read the spring, planted the torch into the earth beside me, and drank a handful of water. And there are some that say that deep, deep in the desert, on cold and moonless nights, a strange man appears. I was about to turn back to the campfire when I saw something out of place beneath the water. A strange man with flashing blue eyes. I pulled the torch out of the earth and raised it higher, and they say that if you ask politely, he will tell you a tale. A large slab of stone lay at the bottom of the spring, the tale of the last man of faith in the great, ancient, and forgotten city of Satan. Nadas on that stone slab beneath the clear waters, I could make out two symbols, a shining golden frond and a large black sun. I turned back towards the campfire to call my guide over to see, but when I looked back, I found that I was alone beneath the moonless night sky. The valley's pulse was a weight, its whispers a truth that lingered in my fate, a truth that followed me to the silence. Story number 3, The Obsidian Call. The Siberian wind howled like a warning, carrying whispers of something ancient and wrong. I stood at the edge of a glacier, its icy mass looming like a god's forgotten altar. My friend Henry had written of a discovery here, a monolith, black and gleaming, surrounded by bones that didn't belong. His letters had turned to madness, scribbles of a man unmade, and I'd come to find him. But as I stepped into the camp, I felt it, a pulse steep and hard, calling from the ice. Henry was my colleague, a man who loved the bones of creatures long dead. His passion lit up every letter he sent from this frozen wasteland, tales of mammoth skulls and strange fossils. But his words grew frantic, speaking of a stone that wasn't stone, a thing that sang to him. I envied his fire, even as it burned him. When his letters became unreadable, I left my dusty lecture halls to find him, driven by loyalty and a curiosity I couldn't shake. The camp was a graveyard of silence, workers muttering, their eyes hollow. Henry was gone, replaced by a sweating, bearded shell, muttering, "It calls, and I see." Dmitri, the foreman, led me to a tunnel carved into the glacier, where the monolith waited. It was obsidian, smooth and endless, its presence heavy, like a truth too vast to hold. Human skulls, their sockets sealed with bone, circled it like offerings. I heard its call, felt its pull, and knew I shouldn't have come. Dmitri warned me not to touch it, his voice tight with fear. He'd seen men die, their screams echoing as they reached for the stone. Henry had touched it, and it broke him. I wanted to resist, but the monolith's song was in my blood, showing me visions, black sands, red cones, my life laid bare. I almost reached out, my hand trembling, when Dmitri's scream snapped me back. He touched it, and the stone claimed it, his eyes glowing violet, his voice not his own. I ran, the monolith's call chasing me through the snow. I left Henry, left Dmitri, left the truth I'd come to find. Now, back home, I lie awake, its song in my dreams. Henry and Dmitri, I less, kneeling before it, I tell no one, for fear they'll seek it out. The monolith is still there, buried in ice, waiting. And every night I feel its pull, whispering that some truths are too heavy to bear, too dangerous to know. Discoveries of the ancient world possess such mystery and intrigue that they can make the most unsophisticated person look upon them in such wonder and admiration. Some truths, though, carry dread forever. In some rare cases, they can possess such knowledge of human existence that dread is carried with it for eternity. The mysteries of humankind and human nature are what made me want to study such history. Yet I knew that some mysteries are best left undiscovered, for in them lies truth. And truth is such a bitter. Henry Trant, my colleague, chased such mysteries in Siberia. Doc, a colleague of mine, Dr. Henry Trant, went on an excavation in the snow-swept steeps of Siberia. There he heard great rumors of a mammoth graveyard, I didn't care for bones, but Henry's passion was infectious. I never cared much for the bones of long-dead animals, but I find admiration in Henry's love for such beasts. He hired a grand crew of workers and diggers. They would hack away at the base of a withered glacier, trying to find more bones and more evidence of wildlife. His letters kept me alive, a professor worn down by time. I followed Henry's excavation closely. It isn't that I cared for what he found. It was more joyful for me to read every letter he sent me and feel the love the man possessed for his work. I'd been a professor for many years, one of history and humanities' time and lackluster students ate away at my soul, and I often wondered what I was doing with my life. He sent photos of mammoth skulls, his joy palpable. Henry sent a letter. Almost every day from Siberia in them, he detailed the great bones of ancient beasts he uncovered. He sent a few photos as well, mostly of him standing among piles and piles of enormous cycloptic skulls with large ivory tusks. His discoveries grew stranger, bones of unknown creatures. I envied him not in a negative way. I envied the joy he found that said his letters grew more and more interesting and more appealing to me. The more he wrote, often he discussed unknown bones of creatures that he's never heard of. He collected them, of course, and over the span of months, he had an entire collection of such strange wonders. They were not a complete skeleton, though Henry admitted to me that he did not think they belonged to the beast like an empty edge. He found a monolith surrounded by human skulls with sealed sockets. He was unsure where they came from, but he was certain that he was on the verge of a great discovery. One letter, in particular, sparked my interest. It was one of the last few he'd sent me, one of the last few that I could read and understand. He described that the mammoth graveyard was something more, something larger than what he had initially thought. He described that the further they dug into the side of the glacier and around its surfaces, the more strange bones they discovered. The mammoths were all dried up, but new creatures merged, ones he couldn't even imagine, and a human skull being discovered around something that he deemed the monolith. Attached to this letter, he placed a photograph. It was the last he sent in it. Henry stood near a large block of stone in some type of cave. It stood roughly 8 feet tall and about 5 feet wide. Its surface was smooth and its color was a glossy black. Its eye sockets, still visible from around the edges, appeared to be sealed with bone, as if the marrow grew to cover the eye. I saw the bones of ancient cities in his photos. At his feet, I noticed many human femurs and other bones that I'd seen during my own excavation of long-dead cities. The letter ended with him asking for my opinion on the matter and to write back as soon as I could. His letters turned to madness, unreadable. I tried to write, "Henry, had I believed that my letters reached him, but something changed within the man that once he responded, I could not make out what his letters were trying to convey. They were a mess of scribbles and drawings, notes, and such an awful handwriting, I believed them to be in dead language. I left to find him. I felt a sense of trouble brewing. I didn't know why, but I just had a hunch that Henry discovered something he shouldn't have. It was then that I took my leave from the university for 2 months, begging my regents to let me finish the excavation that Henry started. Once I provided them with the photos and excerpts from his letters. They let me go to his aid and to try. The journey was grueling, but I reached the camp. I hopped on the first plane to the foreign empire to try to save the mystery of the monolith. It took me a few days to arrive at Henry's campsite. I took trains, rode horses, joined a caravan of traders when the opportunity presented itself. Henry was gone, a shadow of himself. When I arrived at the excavation, Henry was nowhere to be found. I stayed bundled beneath my many coats and hoods, trying to stay warm. Dmitri, the foreman, greeted me, shaken. A young man in his early 30s who spoke fairly good English that approached me. His face was covered in dirt and sweat. He looked tired, withered, and frail. He shook my hand as I approached. "I am the foreman here. Dmitri, who are you?" "I'm a colleague of Dr. Henry Trant," I explained. "He wrote me about the monolith." His fear was palpable when I mentioned the monolith. As soon as the words left my mouth, Dmitri's eyes grew wide. His dark pupils fluctuated with nerves, and I could see his heart beating in the arteries of his neck. He shook his head. "You come to see the doctor." I nodded this way. He led me to Henry, now a muttering wreck. Dmitri took me to the largest tent. Within the campsite, he threw back the flap. As a massive roar of wind came peeling through the grounds, snow and ice peppered my face, forcing me to bury my nose into my jacket. The camp was cold, the glacier ominous. Dmitri stepped into the tent, and I did not follow. For in a moment of hesitation, I looked into the dark navy skies overhead. The low-hanging clouds peeled away for a moment, revealing the mass of glacier before us. It stood tall as a mountain. Great and powerful stone and ice covered every side of the massive structure. It loomed over us. An ancient structure of nature, so powerful that even the sight alone almost stopped my heart. Inside, Henry was unrecognizable, lost to madness. It wouldn't be until I heard the foreman snap his fingers at me and did I break my gaze and step into the large tent. Inside it wasn't much warmer. A fire did sit within a small makeshift furnace in the center of the room. It was the only light source after Dmitri closed the flap behind me. Shadows engulfed the tent with only the hellish glow of the small iron furnace to keep them at bay, the horrendous odor that smelt as if it were death itself. I gagged upon unraveling my face, and it was then that I saw him. My friend Henry sat at a small, portable wooden desk. He wrote away with the long quill on his letterhead. What he wrote, I could only guess the mad ramblings. He was sweating from every pore in his body. He sat naked too. The glow of the furnace light danced, crossed his glistening back as he muttered strange phrases to himself. His eyes weren't his own. I took a step further in shock and horror, not recognizing my unkempt friend. His face became matted with a squirrely gray beard, and his eyes, as strange as it sounds, were not his. I knew the man for years, but those eyes, they did not belong to him. He turned as I stepped forward. As I said to him, "Henry, are you all right? It calls." "And I see," my friend exclaimed, staring up at the ceiling of the tent. Dmitri stopped me, explaining Henry's survival. Quickly, he then turned his head back to his writing and continued to scribble and draw as I began to take another step. I felt a cold, gloved hand of the foreman rest on my shoulder, halting me in place. I turned to face the Russian, and he shook his head at me. "It is all he says. That's it." The foreman nodded. When did this happen? He's the only one who survived. That is, when it happened, the foreman explained. I became confused, shaking my head slightly as my eyes glanced to the dancing shadows of the tent. Survive? What did he survive? The touch of the shape he demanded. 15 workers helped him move the black slam. They all perished. He survived its touch, the foreman said, shifting his gaze from me towards the naked doctor at his desk. He continued. They screamed wildly for a few moments before falling into the snow. Dead, all of them dead. But the doctor, he survived and only says that it called to him. The monolith was no mere stone. I became even more confused. The monolith was nothing but a structure made of black stone. It had to be created by man, ancient man, and such powers was something that I never heard of other than stories from ancient desert treasures. Perpetual. I demanded to see it, despite Dimitri's fear. I fiddled my fingers as I thought, trying to piece together some sort of rational explanation. It was then that I looked to the foreman and asked, "May I see it?" He shook his head. "I don't like to go there." "Why?" "It is such a discovery." The foreman looked at me, removing a hand-rolled cigarette from his jacket. He held it to the flames of the furnace before placing it in his mouth, and taking a deep puff, smoke flowed from his mouth. As the glowing cherry drew my eyes, he said softly, "I think it calls to me too, please," I said. Taking the cigarette out of his hand and taking a deep inhale of smoke, I handed it back to him and explained, "I need to see it." He relented, leading me to the tunnel. He took the cigarette back. I could sense the nerves in his eyes as he looked around the room. He gave an oppressive nod. I felt a sense of shame. I cannot explain it, for I came to visit my friend. But upon the very sight of his unempt state, I could not bear to witness him, for pity filled my heart. My friend, one of the most brilliant men of all, became nothing but a rambling mess. The camp was desolate, bones everywhere. I thought of some of his great work, thinking fondly of his wisdom and knowledge. All the while, Henry continued to mutter in the corner, "It calls to me, it calls to me, and I see it calls to me, and I see it calls to me, and I see the foreman, and I walk through the piles of bones and skulls of long dead animals, the enormous skulls of mammoths, all faced inward on a path towards the excavation site. Workers lingered, broken by the monolith's presence. Not a worker did their job. They all lingered about the camp. A few men sat atop the skulls, muttering to themselves and singing old folk songs, wondering how the hell they would get out of such a dreadful place. The glacier loomed before us, and at the end of the long, snowy path, I could see a small tunnel carved into the surface before it sank in from months of digging. The tunnel was dark, the monolith waiting within. We walked along the scaffolds and other M-shift walkways just to get to the tunnel's entryway. Looking down into the dig side, I could see hundreds of bones most. Randall, I knew that much, others belonged to human, but I felt that some fossils belonged to the unknown. I told myself I was biased because I was going off Henry's crazy words. Yet the twisted, gnarled bones did not fit any description of anatomy for any living creature that I knew of. As the two of us stood in front of the tunnel, Dimitri turned to me and said, "Remember, Professor, do not touch it." It stood tall, obsidian, and perfect, radiating a call I couldn't ignore. I nodded, staring into the dark tunnel before us. Henry had his workers carve out a nice pathway, for the tunnel stood roughly 8 foot high and about 6 feet wide. I could only imagine the months and manpower to dig such a thing. Dmitri led the way into the swirling darkness of the tunnel. He held the lantern ahead of him, but it did no good. The darkness swallowed him and I. As we began our track to the mysterious structure, the tunnel did not extend deeply into the glacier. In fact, it felt like we only walked about 50 feet or less. Though, as I turned my back towards the entrance of the tunnel, I could not see the dark gray light of the early evening. Only black greeted me from where I stood. Dmitri drew my attention, saying here his lantern illuminated the end of the tunnel. Henry's workers had extended the area at the end, making a large circular-shaped room that was big enough to walk around. In the center of it stood the mighty monolith that I had heard so much about. It was taller than I had expected. Could not see at the top of it, for it extended into the rocky surface of the glacier. Its sides were perfectly cut through, smooth to perfection. As well, the material that made up the black slab appeared to be obsidian, a glossy volcanic stone that glimmered under Dmitri's lantern. Its beauty was haunting. Surrounded by bones, I stepped away upon seeing it. My heart could not bear such haunting beauty. The foreman turned his back as his eyes met the structure. He set his lantern on the ground and moved towards the way we came, keeping his back turned as the light of the lantern hit the floor. I could see the skulls and bones of ancient humans. They were baled into fetal-like positions all around the monolith. I was unsure, but it appeared as if they were buried right at top, the others as if were some sacred structure. All their eye sockets were sealed shut with an unnatural bone growth. I felt its call, a song of drums and tongue. I stared into the black of obsidian. I watched as the light of the lantern danced across the immaculate smooth surface. I approached slowly in awe of such wonder. I moved around its side, inspecting the back end. It was the same as the front, yet in the unlit shadows, the back end sat flat in color, not glistening under any amount of light. It appeared to be an empty void. I stared, lost in a trance upon seeing it, and in the distance I could hear the faint sound of beating hearts and dancing tongues. Such a wonder. I could feel it do exactly as Henry said. It called to me. Dmitri pulled me back, warning of its evil. "Don't, Professor," I heard the foreman's voice echo through the tunnel. I turned to see him. He kept his back turned, but it was as if he could sense what I was about to do. Unbeknownst to me, I had extended my hand out as if to touch the black void of the structure. I moved back into the light. Did Bertrand give anything theories as to what it is? Dmitri didn't answer my question. He knelt down and grabbed his lantern, held it high above his head, lighting as much of the small rocky room as he could. He kept his eyes turned away from the structure, not wanting to take a chance. He said to me quickly, "You've seen it, Professor. Let us go." "Do you have any theories?" I asked, stepping away from the monolith. "Evil," Dmitri said. "You heard its call." I nodded. "Evil," he said, turning his back to me. He began to walk down the tunnel the way we entered. I lingered, tempted, but followed. I stood next to the obsidian stone for a moment, not wanting to peel myself away. It was as the light of the lantern vacated the room that I heard the call again. The dancing tongues and beating hearts grew louder with each step Dmitri and his light took. I felt a heat radiate from the stone monolith, and it was then that a panic began to set in me, for I felt the temptation yet again. If Dmitri did not call after me, I don't think I could have resisted. Yeah. That night, Dmitri shared the workers' fate, screaming, dying after touching the stone. That night, Dmitri offered for me to stay in his tent. It was the second largest in the campgrounds. I obliged mostly because I could not bear the sight of Henry. I did try to speak to him once more, but he shunned me. The man, my once beloved colleague and friend, was nothing more than a lost soul in a sea of snow and dread. The only friend I possessed from then on was Dmitri. The two of us sat up past twilight eating watery soup and stale bread, talking to one another about the monolith. We had a fire going and many candles lit. We both feared the darkness with enough pressing. Dmitri recounted the story of how the workers died. He was not there, he expressed, but he did hear the screaming and crying of his workers who tried to help Henry remove the structure from the tunnel. He said that himself and the others who were working in the graveyard quickly rushed inside to see the workers screaming in agony on the floor before perishing. He said that the doctor knelt before the monolith, his hand extended out, touching it. It took 7 men to peel him away, and once they did, he never left his tent, other than to drop his letters in the box of the Weekly Courier. He felt its call, too, and couldn't leave. Dmitri expressed that he believed the doctor to be writing more people than myself, and feared that more would venture to see the obsidian wonder. "Though you still hear it call?" he asked. I shook my head. "I don't hear it. You feel it," he said. He nodded, lighting up a cigarette and offering it to me. I felt it too, and with each visit it grows stronger. He smirked. "Some stay for pay, some stay because they cannot peel themselves away. A few men left last week with a few of the big skulls and large tusks. They came back with everything they took. They just wanted to look upon the window once more. I would not let them, but you, I asked, why haven't you left? You know better than to stay." "I tried. It's not hard enough," I said. He smirked, taking a puff of a cigarette. "You will find it difficult after seeing it. The call extends across the land. It brought me back. As it will you. I'm sorry about it. Sorry I warned you not to see it. You are cursed like the rest of us." "I didn't touch it. I informed him it wants you to." "It is a hard fight, but as long as you're here, make sure that we do not get lowered into this black maw." "I plan to leave at dawn, haunted by Henry's fate." "I plan to leave as soon as it's sunrise," I explained. "I have an eerie feeling about all of this." "Why is that you go?" Dmitri informed me. "It knows. Though the black structure knows we went to sleep not long after that, I felt exhausted after such a long travel, and to realize that I would soon be back on the road made it even more tiresome. I didn't want to stay. I came for Henry but left for myself. There was no studying to be done. The monolith was evil. As Dmitri put it, we went to sleep. Not after that. I felt exhausted after such a long travel. And then to realize that I would soon be back on the road made it more tiresome. I did not want to stay. I came for Henry but left for myself. There was no studying to be done. That monolith was evil, as Dmitri put it. I did not care to stick around, for I feared the worst would come of it. I thought of Henry, such a brilliant man, being reduced to madness, made my heart sink, for I feared the outcome myself. I didn't plan on saying goodbye, and that broke my heart. Though I felt that the true Henry vacated the moment, He touched the black stone, but a nightmare pulled me back, a vision of the monolith's call. I drifted off into sleep after many hours lying awake. I began to have a strange nightmare. It crept into the foreman's tent on the back of the shadows of the night, seeping into my mind like a virus set to destroy me. I imagined myself waking up and hearing the call of the great monolith. I exited the tent without my jacket or scarf. I stood in the roaring winds being pelted by snow and ice that came down from the glacier. I could not feel them, for a fire burned within me. Sweat flowed from my body, dampening my clothes. I marched to the tunnel, drawn by its song. I marched past the massive craniums of the ancient beasts. I dared not look at them, for the call of the monolith exited from the dead. Gaping jaws, their tusks warped and twisted under the winds, as if they were bent by nature itself. I slowly made my way back to the tunnel, fearful yet desiring. What sat at the back of it, the call grew louder and vibrant off the stone walls of the tunnel. I moved inside, finding shelter from the extreme cold of the outside, though I could not feel it. I marched through the swirling darkness, moving closer to the end of the tunnel. They all swirled around me with the shadows of the tunnel as if it took physical form. The monolith glowed violet and searing. When I arrived at the monolith, I stood in its presence, basking in the unimaginable heat that radiated from it. I held my hand out, wanting to touch it, needing to touch it. I could not see it at first, though, for the darkness of the tunnel hid it from my vision. Yet, as my hand grew closer, I could see a cold violet glow sweep from its sides. The aura felt almost blinding to me, yet I needed to see what sat on the other end. My bare hands grew closer. The heat seared the flesh off the tips of my fingers. I flattened my hands, spreading the heat across my palms, and I felt the ancient wisdom of its creator begin to flow through my body. I cannot lie. It felt of ecstasy. Dimitri's voice saved me, but he fell to the stone. It was then, when only a centimeter you from embracing the stone with my touch, that I heard someone call for me. "Professor," I turned my head, seeing Dimitri standing in the tunnel. He held a lantern out ahead of him, and only as the light of the small lantern hit my eyes did I realize that I was not dreaming. I stood in the tunnel, absorbing the heat and listening to the call of the ancient wonder. My reality slowly came into view, and I lowered my hand, realizing the mistake I foolishly made. It was then that Dimitri reached out, trying to grab a hold of me, as if they were living crept from the shadows and somehow tripped the oncoming Russian. He fell forward towards me, and I tried to catch him. His lantern hurled my direction and shattered against the obsidian structure. Flame and oil covered it instantly, causing me to flinch and move out of the way. Dimitri extended a hand as if asking me to catch him. But it was not me who responded before the foreman realized what was happening. His hand rested against the stone structure. He was held, then consumed, his eyes glowing violet. He should have fallen forward onto his face, but it was as if the structure wanted him to be safe and held him in place. For a moment, floating above the skeletons of the floor slowly. Dimitri's legs lowered, kneeling before the monolith as his hands stayed connected. The flames roared wildly around the structure, forcing me to move away and fall onto my back. I shielded my eyes for a moment, but the swirling darkness suffocated the flames quickly, and the purple glow that seeped from the structure sides grew brighter, more vibrant. The monolith showed visions, black sands, a red sun, my life in fragments. The calling stopped. Everything went silent. Then a strange sound echoed from the monolith. It sounded as if a sword were being sheathed in a metal hilt. Everything fell quiet. Dmitri looked back at me and said, "I cannot remove my hand suddenly." As if a hurricane roared inside the tunnel, a cacophony of noises swallowed the two of us. It was deafening, and the call of the monolith danced somewhere behind it. The black stone glowed with a vibrant white light. It became translucent, as if the monolith was no longer a physical structure, but rather a specter. Before the foreman, Dmitri screamed wildly, and the same radiant violet glow seeped from his eyes as he stared into the white abyss. I too could not look away, for images flashed within the structure. I could see fields of black sand and decaying flowers. I could see tall stone structures. I could see towers of ivory and obsidian. I could see a red sun glowing on an empty horizon with black stars twinkling. I could see my own life laid out like pieces on a chessboard. I could see a looming figure across the black ocean. I could see a tall obsidian pyramid, and above it, I could see a wild mass of chaos and dread. Dmitri's screams turned inhuman, and I ran. I could not look away. I tried. I felt the pull for me to touch the structure. I wanted to see more. I had to see more. I reached my hand out again, but a scream from the foreman caused me to retreat. His mouth sat agape, life vacant from his face, with each passing second. His scream at first sounded like human, but grew into a deep, monstrous bellow that echoed from the tunnel and rolled across the glacier. His voice hollowed, deepened, no longer belonging to him. His eyes radiated that hellish violet as he continually screamed, "It call, and I've seen it call, and I've seen it call, and I've seen large black strands of the shadows swarmed around the foreign. They wrapped his body as if he were prey to the monolith, while he could not stop screaming." I fled, guilt tearing at me. I turned my back and ran from the tunnel. The glow of the white ore did not light the path for me. I stumbled in the darkness, trying to escape. I feared it too late for the foreman. I feared it too late for my own self, but I had to try. I stopped for a moment, feeling the guilt of abandoning the man. I wanted to save him. I had to try and save him. It was then that I looked back and saw the white translucent structure before him, and the other side a great strange shape that belonged to the darkness itself. For it was the darkness, and the strands that extended from the structure were part of it. Dmitri continuously screamed. I wept, backing away to escape. I shouted repeatedly as I ran, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." The camp watched, some in awe, some in worship. As I exited the tunnel, the entirety of the camp sat awake. They all exited their tents, and I could see them looking up towards the glacier. In amazement, some cheered, while others bowed to the will of the monolith. I fell to my knees, fearful of what was happening. It was then that I looked up and could see the glowing white of the monolith, piercing through the glacier and extending into the blackness of the night. What low gray cloud sat overhead began to swirl and radiate with the same hellish violet seen in the foreman's eyes. I escaped on horseback. Henry's scream haunted me. I scrambled back to my feet and ran. I gathered my things from the foreman's tent. and took one of a few horses that remained at the camp. I ran away on my ride. I saw Henry exiting his tent. He smirked at me as I ran, and I could see the pale, phosphorus white of the monolith glowing behind his eyes. He screamed in a haunting roar as I exited the camp as fast as the horse would let me. It did not sound human. It did not sound enlightened. The scream rolled over the empty forest of Siberia and followed me until I could no longer see the beam of light from the glacier. I kept silent, guarding the secret. I never returned to the camp. I returned home and spoke not of what I saw or heard. I dared not pique the interest of those seeking a lost discovery. I kept to myself, and if anyone asked, I stated that I never found Henry Trant or his excavation. I lied to keep them safe, yet I still feel its call. I still dream of it. I wake up in the twilight to haunting screams of Henry and Dmitri. I envision myself in the dreamscapes to sheeps of Siberia again, walking the cold skull-lined path towards the glacier. The workers are all there, their eyes glowing with the violent adder of the structure. The white aura calls from the black void of the tunnel. I can feel its call. Those deep drums and dancing tongues. Upon entering the tunnel, I see Henry knelt before the monolith. Dmitri and an assortment of workers are with him. The band of them are nuded and worshiping the ancient structure. Their eyes are burned away from their skulls, and only a glowing violet sits within their hollowed sockets. The call flows from their mouths. I can hear what they say. It calls when I see it calls. You will, I approach, holding my hand out to the monolith. The glowing violet, high of the white light from the shimmering stone showers my cold body, setting my inner to blaze. The same images fell before me. And just as I think that I see what truly lurks on the other side, I awake in a cold sweat. I scream some night, fearful of what I witnessed. Just before I fall back asleep, I can hear the call again, and my heart stops for some. Mysteries are better left undiscovered. When I approach, the monolith's call never leaves me. I see Henry's face, his eyes not his own, and Dimitri's scream echoes in my sleep. The visions, black sands, a red sun, a chaos beyond understanding haunt me, pulling me back to that tunnel. I lied to keep others safe, but I feel it still, a whisper in the dark, urging me to return. Some truths are too vast, too cruel, and the monolith waits, its song eternal, for those foolish enough to listen.